the internet has exploded that. The old myth about the wisdom of the common man, there's no wisdom of the common man. The common man usually is a sciolist, or even worse, listens to sciolists and then starts repeating them. Joe Rogan, in a sense, would be a secondary level sciolist because he will listen to a Jordan Peterson or a Sam Harris or any of these other people, pseudo-intellectuals that he'll have on the show, and he'll spout their stuff then to other people. So he himself doesn't know about psychology like Peterson, or about the way the brain works like Chomsky would, or these, but he will then spout that same nonsense, most obviously with what is the ivermectin crap that he wants spouting about COVID.
Yeah, and it's interesting to compare someone like a Jordan B. Peterson to people like Chomsky in the sense that yes, like Peterson has received a similar level of stature, but in a different way, right? Because Chomsky, at least, like in the past, right, he would have to go through academia in a way where he would have to, submit things at least to peer review, right? We don't have to necessarily make a big deal of it, but on some level, right, it's going to weed out total mistruths in some ways, right? He had to write, books on serious topics, and many of them were good books. He actually did have a valuable contribution to linguistics, right? He did, in some ways, change the field of linguistics before going off on other topics of interest. So he was sort of like, although I guess he was ignored or maligned by some elements of the power establishment, right? Some elements of the foreign policy blob, right? That didn't want to hear what he had to say, but he was still ensconced in these institutions. He definitely had platforms with, the New York Times and similar. But Peterson, he really became popular on the heels of a cultural backlash. He became popular on the heels of, these small internet communities. He became popular on the heels of the common man, right? In a way that Chomsky sort of couldn't, right? You sort of had to at least have some familiarity with the topics that he would discuss.
And Chomsky's been around for 60 years, whether you agree with him. I admire Chomsky's scientific chops. I think he's far more dicey when it comes to history and when it comes to politics, even though I agree probably, again, with maybe 80 to 85% of his political leanings. We have no idea if in 10 years, even if he's alive, Jordan Peterson will still be there. Or is there going to be some scandal where, he was harassing women when he went to Vegas or something? You never know. And that could... He
does have a harassment scandal. He said something during some kind of speech, he said something like, there were 4 separate occasions or something. Maybe it wasn't 4, maybe it was fewer, but 4 separate occasions where he was being under investigation for harassment, which is I understand there are false accusations, but couple some of his very amateurish, sloppy evolutionary psychology. He's one of these people that says sometimes in interviews, I'm an evolutionary biologist. Obviously he's not, right? He's a psychologist, but he often says that to aggrandize himself. And therefore he has very, very sloppy takes on evolutionary psychology. Yeah. It wouldn't surprise me that, he has this history with women in such a way. And now he's using the worst pop, evolutionary psych to sort of justify that.
Yeah. And the thing is, after we decided to do this show, there are very few pre-2017 clips of him that are online, or if they're online, they're on page 42 of Google search, But I did see he wrote a couple of academic books in the 90s. I think one might have been on language. And there was something in 02 or 04 where he was being interviewed by some Canadian cable access channel or something. And his persona was quite different than it is now. And the thing is, yes, we all, Dan Schneider, I'm going to be 57 in less than a week. If you looked at me, I have online in 98 when I was writing a poem on camera, and a fellow named Dylan Wall filmed me. You can see my voice is different. I've got growing long hair again, but a little less on top. So there are going to be differences. But he wasn't mugging for the camera. Once he became famous, you'll see he's famous for the pouty sneer at someone, where the camera will go when someone else is talking. He gets that look of a child who's just been scolded by his mother. He'll do some kind of attack. He'll usually go circuitously in some way, and then whether thinks he's winning or not, he'll sit back and sort of gloat. If you look at some of the early stuff, and I could only find 2 or 3 of them, and he has become a performer. Mm-hmm. He wasn't a performer then. I'm not a performer. Sometimes, like Jessica, for example, told me, put on a shirt that doesn't have stains on it just to do this show. I don't give a shit. But there is absolutely down. He has become Jordan Peterson is now, or Jordan Peterson pundit is now the persona. I don't know if there's even a Jordan Peterson the person left.
Yeah. So a couple things. Let's move on to the Mensa stuff before, right before we get to Chris Lang, and let's actually stay with Jordan Peterson since we've already introduced the topic, and let's go through the Jordan Peterson stuff that we have prepared. I agree. I remember when he first came to prominence, right? It was on the heels of the trans cultural backlash and so on. So he becomes famous off of that. And out of curiosity, I checked his YouTube page and I sent his stuff to you, right? And you pointed out that this guy is just getting more and more right wing with every video, right? Before he became famous, all right, so he had lectures on Nietzsche, it's stuff that I would be, more interested in compared to what he does now. And he was less performative. This is true. And it's very obvious that he has over time, because he understands where he fits, right? He's smart enough at least to understand where he fits in terms of an audience, right? There is a right-left divide, even if it's superficial and it's based on the wrong kind of things. There is this kind of divide. He knows that based on what he says, he cannot get any kind of liberal audience. So he does, crazy shit. First of all, he gets vaccinated, right? Because he may be kind of dumb, but he's not dumb enough to think that vaccination wouldn't work, right? So he gets vaccinated because he doesn't want to fucking die. He's accumulated, I'm sure, all kinds of secondary comorbidities over the past few years. But now, he has videos where he's doubting, maybe I shouldn't have gotten vaxxed. And the only reason he's doing that is because there is a backlash from his audience. What? You got vaxxed, but all these other celebrities that we follow didn't get vaxxed. What's wrong with you? So he has to make nice with them, right? So
let me give you just one counter example, the sort of left-wing version of him, and then we can move on. If you look back in the 1990s on shows that from PBS or Science-Based, where Richard Dawkins appeared. Dawkins was very scientific. He didn't stray into this. Now, if you look once he became one of the 4 horsemen, I guess 20 years ago, 02, 03 is when Sam Harris got big. Bennett was already a name. And then, what's the journalist that died, the Mother Teresa guy?
Hitchens.
And then when Hitchens, they took a pro wrestling name, the 4 Horsemen, from which was originally 4 linemen from football, became wrestling, and now it's intellectual. And he changed. You can barely find, I'd say 5% or less of Dawkins' videos from this century on are about science. The rest is all this stuff about atheism. And I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic. But Dawkins knows where the money is. That's why Dawkins gets in the money. And in the same way, you've seen, like you just said, Peterson knows where the money is. He knows he wants to monetize his videos and whatnot. And both of them are good examples of people scrapping their intellectual bona fides to go for the cheap public thrill.
Yeah. And, the thing that bothers me about people like Dawkins is, if the only contribution that you could make to society is I'm going to memorize all the anti-theist arguments that I could possibly memorize, go on TV and, fight back against every Muslim or Christian or whatever that wants to argue with me. Fine. Right. All else being equal, we're probably better off in the long term without, a mass God or religious delusion versus not. Right. But he's actually made, actual contributions to science in the past. Right. When he wrote The Selfish Gene, I believe in the 80s, that was a scientific contribution. and the fact that he's sort of like, put that away in favor of this other stuff. Like it's someone that, again, is going for the money. And also maybe he just, completely ran out of ideas. With Jordan Peterson, though, his first like academic book was Maps of Meaning. And it's ironic because I remember like in the early 2000s when I was first like getting interested in like stuff, right, in ideas or whatever, I found your site shortly after that. I was pretty suspicious of academic style writing. I was pretty suspicious of people in academia. And when you look back on this book, right now, he's making his reputation based on attacking academics, based on saying there's this kind of Marxist takeover in academia. And yet when you read this early book, it's full of the same kind of language and the same kind of non-ideas that I was suspicious of as a kid. He has never moved past the stage where he's able to make some sort of long-term contribution. He's exactly what I hated in academia, but ironically, he's making his reputation as this kind of like anti-academic rebel, right? And people just don't know any better. People in his audience, they assume that the real issue with academia is, there are too many liberals within it. And while, I'm sure that that's a problem in some ways in terms of like having a diversity of opinion and whatnot, that's not really what the problem is. I think the biggest problem is when you look at all this academic writing and all these ideas, how indistinguishable they are from one another, how the writing just kind of like melds, into itself. I remember like being in my old college, right? I would have like big long breaks between classes. I would go into the library and out of curiosity, I would like flip through like the old academic journals they would have from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And everybody exactly sounded the same. Nobody was really saying anything that seemed at all worthwhile. And Peterson is in the same exact category, right? So, it is very ironic that although I kind of begin, like someone that could be sympathetic to his perspective, it's clear that he's part of the same exact problem that he's critiquing in ways that his audience is made to never, ever understand.
And all of that has to do with the internet. The internet is fueling this. And another perfect example, not individual, but a company, if you will, or I don't know if it is company, the TED Talks. If you look at the TED Talks from the late 90s to the early 00s, 98% science, hard science. After that, once the internet, once you get to like 05 or whatnot, you get a lot of these pseudoscientific people. I've seen TED Talks with the Indian people who would talk about, the different parts of the body, pressure points and all this kind of stuff that isn't scientific. And most of the things that has crept in, I think, has been a lot of right-wing stuff. You would get people who would be suspicious of, the most basic kind of scientific things, because that'll draw crowds. You won't get a TED Talk, however, where you will have someone, for example, taking on the idea of a never-ending universe, that dark matter. We still haven't discovered dark matter, and there are a half a dozen to a dozen other theories that are out there. Now, that's something in narrow academia, but they won't take that on. But you will get someone on TED Talks who will talk about, say, why is the flat Earth? Why have flat Earth become a topic again? These things that are basically, when I was a kid, would have been on a show like called the Leonard Nimoy show, In Search of the Bermuda Triangle. They are taking on these truly non-intelligent, non-academic ideas, and they are trying to make them mainstream. And real scientific debate, like as whether dark matter really exists, is there, will it survive for 50 some years? That is pushed off to the side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's jump back into Peterson, right? So anyway, people like consider this guy like a benign sciolist in some ways. And you originally, when you want to do the show, you're like, this guy is like really malignant. So we're going to get into like why this is, right? Why exactly his influence has been so malignant on society. And we actually have a few videos here that would illustrate kind of, what he talks about, the kind of slates of hands that he's responsible for. And yeah, so let's do this, a screen share. Peterson, he has this video, right? And this is a part of a channel called Motivation Thrive, right? And it's titled "The Truth," one of the greatest speeches ever, right? So before we even get to anything, right, to the extent that people could just kind of in the top fashion see, some random person speaking that's going to have no kind of, historical longevity, and immediately assume one of the greatest speeches ever. That already is a problem. But let's just go through this bit by bit and see what he's like.
Foster Wallace isn't alive, because there's another video. He gave a commencement speech at a college a year or two before he died, and it says the greatest speech ever.
Oh, maybe it's something like a speech on water or something. Maybe we should cover that sometime as well. But anyway, so this is a Jordan B. Peterson, delivering what is supposed to be the greatest speech ever.
In order to find your way through all of that, you need to develop a relationship with something that's profound. And you have that capacity. Like that. And what could be more profound than the truth? And what would you rather have on your side? And to do more than your best, because your best isn't enough.
I mean, like, even so,
all the way through.
Yeah, like, I mean, even so far, right? He's saying that, to have a purpose in life, you need to, cultivate this relationship with the profound. I mean, look, I agree with that, right? And I'm sure that you agree with that yourself. But the fact is, most people will never be in that scenario, right? They're not going to be able to have, a deep and abiding relationship with art, a deep and abiding relationship with Nietzsche, a deep and abiding relationship with, like, any, highfalutin thing that we could come up with. Only a few people do that. The rest, they need to find meaning elsewhere. It's not necessarily worse in the sense that, their lives are going to be like, less satisfying or whatever. But, it's a different kind of profundity that he doesn't give much attention to. And instead, he's kind of starts in this kind of like cultish fashion. He says, you need to cultivate a relationship with the truth, because what could be more profound than the truth? And the reason why it's such a silly cliche is, well, yes, I guess in some ways the truth could be profound, but the problem is everyone will be fighting about what is true and what isn't. The whole point of us taking on Peterson here is because we think that his spin on the truth is just that. It's spin. It's not actually true.
Before you start, let me just give you an example. On Facebook, I have one of my Facebook friends is an old manager of mine, an old boss. And I've been posting recently or sharing videos of cops. There's what's called First Amendment audit videos. I don't know if you ever heard of them, where when people are stopped, they have dash cams and they record all the bad shit cops do. And so this guy has been basically trolling my Facebook page for a while. And I after Jessica and Ethan and a few other people were upset about something, so I said, let me take care of him. And so I said to him, listen, because this old boss of mine says, why don't you put videos where cops do good things? I said, that's not the point. And then we sort of talked about things there. And I said, and he's like, he says, all of these people at the cops stop, basically, they need to buck up and work hard and do this. And he said, I've worked for everything I got. And I said, when you say I work for everything you got, implicit in that is that other people don't. These people in the videos, black or white or Hispanic or what, don't. In the same way, and Jordan Peterson, I'll give him, is a lot smarter than my ex-boss in many things, I'm certain. But he is using the same low-born tactics that this non-academic ex-boss of mine is using. Implicit in what he's saying here is that, I have the way. I've found the way. You got to do it my way. Instead of there being myriad roads to nirvana, you have to cultivate, a relationship with truth. Fuck truth. I'll stick with reality because, as I've said, truth is just a comment on reality. But someone like Peterson probably knows that. But again, he's selling snake oil deliberately because if you go there, how many views did that have? I'll bet you'd had probably 5 million views minimum.
Yes, it's probably close. Yeah.
Yeah. He's acting
almost 1 million. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So it's less than I thought. But but I'm sure there's probably over 1 billion views for Jordan Peterson, maybe 10 billion or whatnot. But my point is, he is clearly acting right here when he's talking. You see them. It reminds me, I've mentioned this before. When I went to see Donald Hall read poetry after his wife, Jane Kenyon, died in the late 80s, I went with a female friend of mine. And after about 10 minutes of Donald Hall reading the poems and then, choking up, whatnot, I said to her, I whispered, I said, he's acting. I said, watch. And I said, I'll squeeze your arm. And within 5 seconds, he's going to tear up again every time he does. I squeezed her arm about 20 times because I knew that Hall was using his dead wife to sell this book of his. He's acting in much the same way. And if I was there and you and I were in the audience and I was squeezing your wrist, you'd probably have a black and blue mark for all the times he's hitting these same notes. This is very studied. This is very deliberate. This is acting. He is acting. He's a good actor. You know, he's obviously a better actor than you or I could be because, I don't have that many, I couldn't garner that many hits and I'd say a lot wiser things than he's saying.
Yeah, like, remember the video of him, like he does a lot of crying, right? A video literally crying about the idea of Western civilization. It's so, anyway, let's just continue with this video.
Because your best isn't as good as you could be. You have to push yourself past that. And that's, as far as I can tell, where you find what you need in life. You find the meaning that sustains you in life.
It's Oprah for white guys, right? This is like Oprah for lonely white guys, right?
Action that redeems.
And what do we need? We need an attractive young blonde woman.
Yeah. Well, this is the guy that's like putting together a video.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah. But it gets to the
but that's the idea, right? That's
this is what the people who think he's smart and a genius. This is what they want. They want to be able to regurge what he's saying to impress this white girl to get her in the sack with them.
World.
Go ahead.
Nietzsche said that you could tell much about a man's character by how much truth he could tolerate, which is very interesting. There's
and they want to be this guy, right? They're like, they want to be thoughtful and philosophical.
This guy reminds me of that old Shania Twain video of the guy taking a shower. She's listening
through the truth. And I believe that to be the case because I don't think that you can manifest who you are without the truth. And so I think it's literally and metaphorically truth, that the pathway to who you could be if you were completely who you were is through
into the light,
the truth. And so the truth does set you free, but the problem is that it destroys everything that isn't worthy in you as it sets you free.
Isn't it just kind of ironic how like he's doing this video on truth and authenticity, and yet we prefaced everything by talking in detail about his like years and years of audience capture and acting, right? That's literally like what he's doing, and yet this is a video about authenticity. It's just insane.
And I know Peterson himself to make the video, but this goes to the mindset of his audience. Again, a beautiful young brunette. First we had a blonde, now we have a brunette. Because all of these kinds of things are going to help you get. This is Madison Avenue, and he's speaking in Madman speak.
Yeah. And another reason why probably you have, at this point, like 50-50 collection of like men and women is realistically, I would be shocked if more than, if his audience is not, any less than something like 98% men. Right. So women aren't interested in this kind of shit.
And that's a process of burning, and it's painful. Because you cling to what you shouldn't be.
I will give him props. He did pronounce Nietzsche correctly.
Partly out of laziness.
Nietzsche, but it's Nietzsche.
And so then you encounter something true. And you all know this. You all know this perfectly well. Because when was the last time that you learned something important that wasn't a blow of some sort? And it's often you look back at your life and you think, oh, God, I really learned something there. I wouldn't want to do that again, but it really changed my life. Sometimes it can really destroy you, an encounter with the truth, and you never really recover. But now and then something comes along and straightens you out, and a lot of you has to go.
Another irony, like going into his personal life, right? I don't want to be like, insensitive here, but he did develop a drug habit. And the reason why I think it's perfectly okay to go there is he developed a drug habit. And after this became clear to everyone that this was in fact the case, you would have his daughter who runs her own podcast and you know, like people that, you know, sort of were like spokesmen for him. They would say like, by the way, this is not a drug addiction. This is like something else entirely. He's not even able to concede. Like he has been so dishonest with his audience for years and years that when actually something profound, let's call it profound, does happen to him, which is like almost dying in a Russian hospital somewhere due to all of this, he's not even able to accurately and honestly relay the information and how this like affects him in a way that would be useful to his audience, actually useful to his audience. He's not able to talk about the fact that he has an addiction. Guess what? Lots of people have addictions. They have addictions, even if they're not necessarily chemical addictions. There's certain behaviors that certain people just cannot stop. He's not able to talk about that because he's spent such a long time building this facade for himself that, you know, now this video, like, I'm not sure exactly when it was made, but, you know, it's just so ironic given everything that has transpired since.
Yeah, I know next to nothing about his personal life. Is he married?
He's married, and the addiction had to do with like some drugs he was taking because his wife had cancer and he couldn't cope with it. I'm not sure if she's still living or she died, but you know, so like, I mean, it's perfectly understandable. Like there should not be any kind of shame in that. And yet, because he has spent such a long time talking about pick yourself up by the bootstraps, like using this term, which started, of course, as a sarcastic phrase from Mark Twain, you know, using terminology like that, always try your best. Like in this video, your best is not good enough. He's not able to honestly deal with these problems in a way that truly would be useful to his audience, that he claims to, you know, I want to protect young men. I want to give them a purpose. I want to give them a direction. Well, how about you share, you know, actual experiences in a way where you're not just faking your way through it?
A lot of you have
how
to
about
burn
how
away.
about non-white young men?
And I suppose in some sense
that's not going to happen.
Is that everything about you that isn't worthy is to be put into the flames, and that's another reason to be not so casual about claiming what you believe, because it isn't.
My cliche meter here is at about two and a half dozen, maybe 25, 30.
I learned when I was a kid,
cliched and hypocritical. It's crazy.
Little older,
and we're less than 3 minutes in. So
almost everything that I said was one form of lie or another, and I wasn't any worse, I would say, than the people that I was associating with.
That's the young
better.
Peterson. And that's
the lies were manifold. You know, they were attempts to win arguments for the sake of winning the argument. That might be one. Attempts to indicate my intellectual prowess when there were competitions of that sort, maybe just the sheer pleasure of engaging in an intellectual argument and winning.
And the crazy thing about this part is, like, I mean, think about what he's doing. Like put yourself into like the mind of a cult leader or a guru of some sort. He's saying, you know what, guys? I used to have all these flaws within myself when I was a child, right? He creates all this like artificial distance between himself today and himself as a child. And he's basically saying that, you know, I don't have all these problems any longer. I put away these things when I was a teenager, or maybe like by the time I finished college or whatever it was. And now I am here to give you the way. Right.
This reminds me of some of the early videos you'll watch from the 50s or 60s from Ayn Rand. She's another one. Yeah. I purged myself.
We could have done that too.
Yeah. But go ahead.
Yeah. Again, like all this kind of, you know, this is such guru speak, and he's doing such a disservice to the people that he claims to want to help, right? Creating all this artificial distance. And we know for a fact that all these things that he's talking about as if it's in his past, they apply, I would bet, much more so to the present Jordan Peterson than to the Peterson of 30 years ago. And that's just a fact.
It actually
my inability to distinguish between ideas that I had read and incorporated because I had read, but hadn't realized that I hadn't yet earned the right to use all of that. And, you know, I had this experience that lasted a long time. Well, I would say it's really never gone away. And I think this was the awakening of my conscience, essentially. This voice, for lack of a better word,
he's sticking pretty well to this 7 or 8 cliches a minute.
Yeah. It's really incredible. Again, all the people
I can't do that. I can't do that because I actually speak what comes to my mind. I give me a script. I'll be off script within 20 seconds.
And that's the thing. Like
he's got a great memory. I'll give him that. He knows.
I'm positive that there's tons of people in his audience that wouldn't give the time of day to an Oprah. And despite like substantively getting someone exactly like Oprah, just as, just as like callous, right? Just as manipulative, just as money hungry, right? As Oprah, and put like a different skin color, put a different gender, a different country on him, a different set of cliches, right? And they're not able to tell the difference. Like it really is incredible.
So, well, it's a different set of cliches to a degree.
Cosmetically, it's a different set of cliche.
Manifest. That's Oprah speak right there. What's on the screen right now?
Yeah.
Inside me, and it said every time I said something that wasn't true, and that's usually what it said. That's not true. You don't believe that. Or there was a sensation that was associated with it. I don't think this is that uncommon. I asked my psychology classes for many years in a row if they had an experience, that they had a voice in their head, let's say, it's a metaphor, or a feeling that communicated to them when they were about to do something wrong. It was universally the case that people agreed with one of those statements or another. And the other thing I would ask is, well, do you always listen to it? And of course, the answer to that was definitely no. Well, I learned that so much of what I was doing was false. And I think I learned this. There was a reason that this came to me so clearly. I was trying to understand why people did terrible things. And I was really concentrating on the terrible, terrible things that people do. And I was interested in...
We're all against murder. We're all against genocide.
For example. And not as a political phenomenon, but as a psychological phenomenon.
There's actually a video that goes, Jordan Peterson tells why Hitler was worse than you thought.
Yeah.
Who the fuck? It's titled that? It's like, really? Really?
This reminds me of Norman Finkelstein when he said he quoted Elie Wiesel when Wiesel was like, you know what? I thought the Nazis were bad, but I didn't think they were this bad. They even tried to take money from Jews and steal their, private property. It's like, okay. But this part is
because grand theft doesn't compare with murder, mass murder.
And this part is interesting, right? So like he starts talking about how, he always like brings up like, authoritarians
how could
from
you
the
be
past.
Like an Auschwitz god? Listen to sciolists. Listen to bad advice like you're giving. That's the very way. And I'm not saying that Peterson himself has aspirations to be a Hitler or anything, but if you want to know how people can get led astray, just listen to pablum like this.
And this part is interesting because he will try, you will notice, he will try to completely divorce any kind of material reality for like, well, how does someone become an Auschwitz guard? From, actually what happens, right? And he's trying to like idealize it in the sense where like he becomes like really obsessed with, well, how could I prevent myself? How could I prevent myself from ever being that way? Just listen to this part.
How you could be an Auschwitz guard. And I wasn't really curious about how you could be one because, well, you could be one, that, of course. I was more curious about how I could be one, being such a good person as I thought I was. But I also knew that many people did many terrible things during the 20th century. And the idea that I was somehow better than them, or that I should assume a priori that I was better than them and that I wouldn't have made the same choices or worse had I been in the same situation, was a very, very, very dangerous supposition. And that we really needed to understand why it happened, and that perhaps we could go deep enough in that understanding, which is, I think, what happens when you go deep into understanding, so that you could stop it. Because if you understand a problem, you can solve it. And at least in part, I came to believe
you have solved your problem. That's what the solution is.
Yeah. Essentially, he says something like, "Don't be that way." How to not be a Nazi guard. Don't be that way. I think that's a verbatim quote. Let's see if it's verbatim.
The problem was, as Solzhenitsyn said, that the problem is that the line between good and evil runs down every human heart. And I was reading Jung at the same time, and he believed that the human soul was a tree whose roots grew all the way to hell.
This isn't big word throwing around.
In the full
name throwing around.
Investigation of the shadow, which was
another blonde girl.
The human psyche.
Don't you just want to kiss those lips?
It was bottomless, essentially.
I have to have
her. It was like an experience of hell.
Look at her.
And
it's a romance book.
Also struck me as
he's the Fabio of academia.
The way to stop those sorts of things from happening was to stop yourself from being the sort of person who would do it.
Isn't that incredible? That's like the solution to genocide. Think about it. That is the solution to genocide. Just don't do it, guys. Don't do it. Like there's and that's the thing. Like his entire philosophy, as we'll see, like in later videos when he's talking about poverty and stuff like that, is so divorced from any kind of like deeper material reality. Like if you want to go back in time, right, and think about, well, how could we have prevented, Nazi Germany from rising in power? Well, one of the things that you could have done is you could have prohibited corporations from doing business with these people. I remember reading like a book on Nazi German by Stefan Zweig. And he was like, one thing that I noticed that was incredible was little by little, Nazi Germany became just larger and larger. We started seeing all these trucks on the street that we knew that we couldn't afford previously. What's going on? And this money had to have come from somewhere. It did not come from Germany itself. It was coming in externally. What is going on there? And we do the same things now, right?
Family.
We arm Saudi Arabia because it's an ally. We arm Israel because it's an ally. We arm all kinds of dictatorships. We do essentially the same things materially that have, functionally the same effect as, a genocide would, even if technically, some of these things don't rise to the level of genocide. The suffering is more or less similar. So now, there's no level of analysis like that in anything that he's saying, much less like, okay, going back to like the Versailles Treaty, like he's not ever going to go there. For him, history moves according to personal individual choices that people make and not a mass of human choices and a mass human probability space that will tend to play out similarly again and again and again and again, as long as the variables remain the same, right? He's completely allergic to this kind of analysis.
Now, here's the thing. He didn't make the video, Peterson. I'm not going to claim he did. But the images that are being inserted in between his bone mows here are done by his fan. Obviously, a fan did that. This is what the fan is getting. Look at the images. Sex and death. It's like a Woody Allen farce here because we get these comely girls. Here we have had about, I guess it was maybe 12, 15 seconds of focusing on an attractive young female's lips. All the girl needed to do was part or stick her tongue out, and it couldn't have been more blatant. And then we get the images of the Holocaust, sex and death, sex and death. This must be deep here because this is what is going on. And whoever made this video, whatever young male probably made this video, and this is the kind of black and white, simplistic kind of stupidity that is generated by the people that listen to this guy and think this guy is intelligent, think he's deep, think he's saying something. I mean, we're now here a little over 7 minutes in. There had to be close to 50 cliches here.
Yeah. Let's just go through like the next 5, like without stopping, and then just like digest what happens.
Who would even start to do it? Because the other thing you learn when you learn about atrocities of that sort, for me, it was a matter of understanding that the way to stop such things from happening, the way to remember properly, is to understand that you could do it, that you could do those terrible things, because the people who did them were like you, and that the way out of that is to stop being like that.
What the fuck?
And the way you stop being like that is by ceasing to tell yourself lies that you don't believe in and that you shouldn't act out.
My life.
Oh my God.
And that's made a huge difference in my life, for better or for worse. I mean, it was very uncanny experience, I would say, because it's very discombobulating to experience yourself as fragmented enough so that much of what you do and say is actually
Light
false.
in the darkness.
It's a lot of work to clean that up. A lot. But
just take a
the consequences are, in principle, worthwhile. And so that was part of what
Jesus Christ
drove
pose
me towards clinical psychology,
Look at that.
staying away from
minus the music, minus the great music.
Law and from politics in general, because I started to believe that, and I think this is the great Western idea, the proper route forward for the redemption of the individual and for mankind as a whole is
Redeemer.
As a consequence of the redemption of each individual. And I truly believe
the guy who
that.
made this is
and I
his
believe
new
that
Christ.
that occurs as a consequence of
Another
adherence to
comely
the
young
truth
woman.
and courage in
Jesus,
the face of
Jordan,
being. That's
starts
rule
with
one,
J,
right?
must be a
Stand up
connection.
straight with your shoulders back, is to take on the onslaught and to enter the contentious ring
of a young
and to do more than.
Have all these people been white so far? I've just noticed that. Are they all of them white? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You asked me about, I've never really been into white blonde girls. So like maybe if they had some other types, I would be more into
Let's
this.
get some booty.
Because your best isn't enough. Because your best isn't as good as you could be. You have to push yourself past that. And that's, as far as I can tell, where you find what
This
you
is from the
need in
Gene
life.
Hackman movie,
You
Hoosiers,
find the
about a
meaning
college
that
basketball
sustains
team.
you in life, and you find the patterns of action that redeem the world, both at the same time.
Again, you come with
Life
young
is a
woman,
very difficult business.
white.
You know, it's fatal, and it's full of suffering, and it's
Well, now we're
and
getting
it's
a
full
little
of
young.
betrayal and malevolence. There's nothing about it that's trivial. It's all profound. And in order to find your way through all of that capacity for hellish experience, let's say,
Burning match tip.
you need to develop a relationship with something that's profound. And you can. You have that capacity. And what could be more profound than the truth? And what would you rather have on your side? And you might say, well, that's obvious. And of course, everyone should do that. And then you need to know why you don't. And the answer is, well, the burns are still healing. It's like, well, you know, there's no shortage of deadwood to burn off. And there's no shortage of pain when the deadwood burns off. And that's what makes people afraid of the truth. And so
that guy was in a Holocaust.
What's the decision that you make? You know, you decide to believe. You know, it's a risk, an existential
That's a Nazi
risk.
guard.
It's an active faith.
Stomping his boots.
You believe that the truth can set you free. You believe that people have an intrinsic divinity about their soul.
Like Baron von Munchausen.
You decide that you're going to live in that manner and that you're going to let everything about yourself that isn't worthy of that goal die. And that might be almost everything that you are. And that's a terrible thing to contemplate.
Ironically,
the only thing that's worse,
this is such a
I would say, is
thought out
the alternative
set of images. But
because the alternative is the sorts of hells.
Well, it's actually extremely well thought out in terms of getting people to like, getting people to subscribe, getting people from his audience interested in your channel, right? It's a perfect set of images for that, right? So we have to think like a businessman if we want to approach the whys and wherefores of JBP.
Maybe I should get a couple of porno star females to do some lesbian 69ing as intros to my video. I get a lot more hits, I'm sure.
If you notice in some of your videos, like how to write a sex scene with like a picture of like a half naked lady or whatever, those tend to get like 50,000 views.
We managed to produce around us, and that we produced with particular expertise during the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. And it would be a good thing if we decided collectively and individually not to go back there again.
Dramatic. He's going to do this by the end of the video.
Thank you.
There he does. Tell me that this was not scripted, that he didn't have a plan for doing it. Look at the way he's looking down there. I mean, he's better than Donald Hall ever was. Look at that. There we go. He looks like a Catholic priest who just molested a choir boy and now has got to go out and give the sermon. Hey.
Yeah, so I mean, like, this is again like Oprah level shit. You just switch the skin color, some of the assumptions, but substantively, it's all the same garbage, right? It's all the same greed. It's all the same nonsense.
And I don't see how you can say he's not a malignant narcissist, because the video is evidence of the shallow sort of thinking that of the people he's trying to reach. That video is a display of the malignance that propagates in the people who take him seriously are capable of.
I mean, like, we're talking about how to prevent genocide, and it amounts to little more than A, don't be like that, and B, why don't you just not tell yourself lies? Like, do you think Hitler was like thinking that he was lying to himself? Like, is that really? It's just so silly.
And if you purge yourself of genocidal thoughts, there'll be a comely young 20-something blonde girl who'll be ready to fuck you and suck you.
Yeah, and at the end again, it's like, if we could just collectively come together and decide, well, no fucking shit. Like, is that? Anyway, let's move on to the next one. So his finest moment is this. Yeah, this is like more like on oppression type stuff. So this is going to get a little more into material reality, but in a way that kind of shows exactly what's lacking in his analysis. And this is from 2017, over 1 million views. So again, if we're assessing his malignancy,
I'm actually surprised. I figured he'd be in the tens of millions by now.
I'm sure many are, but for the purposes of like what we want to use, like for this video, these videos were probably more appropriate. But he definitely has videos that are like approaching those numbers. Definitely,
it's a big problem here. The problem is, it's true. You're oppressed, you're oppressed, you're oppressed, you're oppressed. God only knows why. Maybe you're too short, or you're not as beautiful as you could be, or your grandparent was a serf, likely, because almost everybody's great-grandparent was. It's like, and you're not as smart as you could be, and you have a sick relative, and you have your own physical problems, and it's like, frankly, you're a mess. And you're oppressed in every possible way, including your ancestry and your biology, and the entire sum of human history has conspired to produce.
Yeah, look at those idiots just laughing.
With all your individual pathological problems. It's like, yes, true. Okay, but the problem is that it is true. And so if you take the oppressed, you have to fractionate them. It's like, you're a woman. Yeah, okay. Well, I'm a black woman. Well, I'm a black woman who has 2 children. Well, I'm a black woman who has 2 children, and one of them isn't very healthy. And then, well, I'm a Hispanic woman, and I have a genius son who doesn't have any money, so that he can't go to university. And, I had a hell of a time getting across the border. It was really hard on me to get my citizenship. My husband is an alcoholic brute. It's like, well, yeah, that sucks too. And so, let's fix all your oppression. And we'll take every single thing into account, and then we'll fix yours too. We'll take every single thing into account. It's like, no, you won't, because you can't. You can't. It is technically impossible. First of all, you can't even list all the ways that...
All right. So like what jumps out here is like, okay, so even if we were to concede that it's technically impossible to fix every single oppression that exists right now, overnight, or whatever, kind of straw man that he's setting up, you could reduce them as much as you possibly can. This reminds me of this, there's this guy that I know, this Jewish guy. We meet up once every year or so to discuss Israel-Palestine and lose our minds on each other and just argue. And recently we met up, and he was making the point that if you have different groups that are have like different levels of oppression, at what point do you stop sort of supporting them? At what point do you say, okay, well, we've done what technically we're able to do and what technically we ought to do. Now you're on your own. And my answer is the following. Historically, and up to this day, the answer is we never, ever, ever stop. Because let's say, for example, that you have, some kind of event that happens overnight, and overnight the mortality, or rather the lifespan of Black Americans or Jewish Americans or whatever, drops by 50%. Isn't it up to the state and collectively just all of society to do everything within their power to reduce that overnight change from 50% back to parity at a minimum? The answer, I think most people would say, is yes. And we constantly go around in life playing whack-a-mole with new forms of oppression, new forms of unfairness. I think, in the next century, we'll probably see, people that are physically attractive, like their privileges little by little being whittled away with, because, so much of life is unearned privilege, right?
Let me contextualize this outside of this. It reminds me of the anti-evolutionist argument that an eye couldn't have developed all by itself because it wouldn't serve any purpose. Yet eyes have developed many times over. And of course, you don't go from having no eyes. You go from photoreceptor cells on the skin to eyes in maybe 100 to 500 to 1,000 evolutionary steps. But of course, each step gets you a little closer and better, and that's what makes it. But if you have 50% of the vision of a great eye, a human eyeball, that's better than having 25 or 10%. He lives in such a black and white world. It's either all or nothing, and that's the same kind of faulty logic. Because if someone is near the point of death and they're suffering from 7 diseases, and you can give them a shot that gets them that they're going to live, but live poorly, but only have 2 main diseases, wouldn't you do that? You're never going to get him out of the wheelchair, let's say, if one of the diseases is polio. You're never going to. Isn't it better, though, that someone has less disease? We're either going to have someone who's so far gone that they're going to be dead in 3 days, or we can make you, a paraplegic that will otherwise live a good life. Being a paraplegic is better than being dead. But that kind of logic does not figure into his world.
And it's also self-contradictory, right? Because he makes a lot of videos, like when we're going to get into the next video is going to be like worldwide poverty, right? He's constantly making the claim that over time humanity is improving, right? People, even if we have greater numbers of people in poverty now, the proportion is going down. And I do believe that, within the next few centuries, we probably will not have something like we see today, which is like extreme poverty. That's probably not going to exist. But if what he's saying about that is correct, right? If we were to make that concession, well, doesn't it stand to reason that what I said earlier is in fact how society works? We constantly play whack-a-mole with these problems until we reduce them as much as we possibly can. Like what he doesn't get is, or rather, maybe he does get it, but what his fans don't get is his function, right? In this world, right? In this kind of niche that he fills intellectually is, let us, while pretending like we're not doing it, let us do everything within our power to keep the status quo as is. If you want to make this kind of change, if you want to make that kind of change, don't do it. If you want to make a change to the tax code and do some sort of redistribution scheme, don't do it, right? It's all meant for status quo thinking. And, Steven Pinker, obviously, he falls into this as well. I did that show in Steven Pinker. It was like Artifact number 13, I believe it was. But anyway, and, he's fulfilling this niche really, really well. He's playing these word games nonstop. And you see these, people in the audience, and I'm sorry, I shouldn't say this, but they just look so dumb and they're just laughing at things that aren't fucking funny. And you could always tell, I think you could always gauge a person's level of intelligence to the extent that he or she laughs at things that clearly have no humor whatsoever. But anyway.
That you're oppressed. Second, how are you going to weight them? Third, who's going to decide? And that's the bloody thing. Who's going to decide? That's the thing. Well, what's the answer in the West? It's like in free markets. Oh yeah, Christ, we'll never be able to solve this problem. No one can solve it. What are we going to do about that? We're going to outsource it to the marketplace. You're going to take your sorry, pathetic being and you're going to try to offer me something that maybe I want. And I'm going to take my sorry, pathetic being and I'm going to say, well, all things considered.
And he's trying to create this parity between himself and these other four. What fucking oppression does this guy face? It's just insanity, right? He's trying to create this equality between the two and essentially saying that, well, because I can't do it for myself and I can't do it for you, we're not even going to try, is really what this comes down to, right? So much of it. As well as I can understand them, maybe I could give you this much money, which is actually a promise, for that thing. And you've packed all of your damn oppression into the price.
And I've packed all my oppression into the willingness to pay it. And that solution sucks. It's a bad solution. But compared to every other solution, man, it's why 10% of us have freedom. And so there's a tremendous illogic at the bottom of this. It's like...
Where did he get this calculus? I mean...
Yeah. It's just, it's out of his ass. It sounds good, right? That's all it comes down to.
This is one of the reasons that I try to avoid when I argue with people, whether it's about Will Chamberlain or basketball or whether it's something a little bit more socially relevant. I try to avoid just picking out these kinds of statistical kind of things, because statistics lie all the time. He's what? I think a year or two older than me, so he's probably pushing 60. He's born and raised in Canada. He's a white male. If he wasn't raised in Toronto, there's a good chance that he's before he became a professor, he probably knew like 11 non-white people in his life.
Yeah.
What kind of oppression could he have? He doesn't have to be a millionaire, but I mean, what kind of oppression did he have? Is he Jewish? Is Peterson Jewish? I don't think so.
No. And yeah, this is kind of you sort of notice this, even at the beginning, like the examples that he was giving, right? They tend to be like such kind of, in most of those examples, rather, they tend to be like really, really low stakes, right? He's constantly making light of this idea of oppression, even though he pays lip service to the idea that, it's actually, it's so terrible and profound, blah, blah, blah. He's constantly making light of it when it comes to the point of the dialectic where, logically it would start to matter, right? At that point, he wants it to not matter, right? And he sets up the arguments to work precisely in that way.
You have to fractionate the oppressed all the way down to the level of the individual.
But what if the individuals eventually form into a group that follow the same exact patterns of oppression and statistically follow enough patterns that you could create very good predictions in terms of how the average in this population will play out? Like, this is literally what we're talking about, right? This is what it comes down to, right? Like, there is oppression at the level of the individual, but eventually they aggregate into a group, right? Oppression does not merely fall upon a person. It's felt by one person. But when we're talking about policies, when we're talking about making any kind of changes that matter, it's always going to be the group dynamic, because the averages is ultimately what shapes society, right? It's not the choice of a person.
And this gets to the heart of the whole critical race theory thing, because no one in critical race theory who wants to just acknowledge it is saying that every black person has to end up, out of poverty. Every black person has to have a good marriage and family values and whatnot. But it's about recognizing the things that have been done and are still being done to certain groups: blacks, Native Americans, Hispanics, gays, whatever it might be, and alleviating some of that to try to balance the scales. This is a typical of someone who has had the scales in his favor, but goddamn, if we balance them a little bit, we're taking something away. Even if there's nothing materially taking away, percentage-wise, in their calculus, if someone comes up to them, they didn't earn it. It's like that fellow I said who was a boss. I worked hard for my what all I have. Other people didn't. I can guarantee you, not you, Alex, not that boss of mine, not me, and not Peterson. Not one of us, and I'm a goddamn hard worker, not one of us has ever worked a single day as hard as one day in the South Carolina sun in 1840 as a slave.
Yes. And, for that reason, whenever people say stuff like, I've earned it, I don't think there's like pretty much anyone living in the United States of America that has earned anything, right? Because the further that you go, like to some of these places where you got to work like 16 hours a day just to survive, right? Yeah. You get closer and closer to this idea of earning. And of course, the issue there is not even so much whether or not they earned it. They're not getting what they deserve, right? So they've earned a lot more than what they're getting. And the crazy part about all this is, when you think of even modern conceptions of like what conservatives would claim today to be like their philosophy on life, a bedrock principle even today would be something like, we can't have unequal consequences for equal behavior, right? That is a bedrock conservative philosophical principle. And yet all in society all the time, we get unequal consequences for equal behavior. And the way that it works is as follows. If you are born into a bad situation, let's say, as a group, right? Black person, Native American, you're going to be born statistically into a group average that is not as good in terms of all kinds of outcomes compared to a white person. That's just a fact. On the individual level, what this means is you constantly have to work harder to get the same thing that other people that don't have the same obstacles end up getting. So we get again and again in society unequal consequences for identical behaviors. A girl that's 15 years old that's able to go get an abortion versus a girl that's 15 years old that's not able to get an abortion because she can't afford it or because it's too far away, they're going to have very different life outcomes, right? If you're able to be 15, get rid of a pregnancy, go on to college and live a normal life versus you're 15, maybe you have to drop out of high school and suddenly, everything in your life changes. Again, but these are identical behaviors, unprotected sex, broken condom, whatever you want to call it, but unequal consequences. This ought to be a bedrock principle, but because this isn't even, what Peterson believes, right? He doesn't really believe in this stuff. He's there to fulfill a status quo kind of thinking. So he's not even, ironically, that past video, be honest with yourself. He's not being honest with his principles even here. And you could tell.
Even to get more pointedly, that girl, that 15-year-old girl that can't afford to get the abortion, she's going to have different consequences than the 15-year-old boy that knocked her up. Because the boy can walk away, the boy can pay her off, the boy can for years demand this, that, or that. She's the one who's going to have to carry the fetus for 9 months. She's the one that's either going to be stuck with in poverty, as we know some people have done that. She's the one that's going to have to make the choice to give the kid up for adoption or not him. So even there, there's unequal choices. But this is these conservative values that someone like him, if you read between the lines, he's never going to be one of these people. He's not going to be a Mitch McConnell type. He's not going to be one of the Rand Paul types. But he is in the same vein. He's just a slicker, more intelligent, more gussied up version of a Rand Paul.
Yeah, and someone that I think all politicians in some level, like people that follow like the inner workings of politicians in some ways, they're kind of like the people that think they're too smart for like Justin Bieber celebrity gossip or whatever the fuck, right? This is all kind of and for Peterson, right? To him, it's like, well, I don't want to be a politician, but I want to be this kind of cultural warrior, right? I don't want to deal with the day-to-day bullshit of politics, but I want the spotlight on me. Right. I am narcissistic in that way. I have nothing. And the narcissism comes through, not even because you necessarily won the limelight, but because you have nothing to contribute. Right. You could get the limelight if you've earned it. That's fine. Right. That's not narcissism. Right. That's recognizing, hey, I did something worthwhile. Yeah. Give me some fucking attention. Give me what I deserve. That's fine. But this isn't what's going on. Right. So.
Well, that's what the West figured out. There's a couple of figures who are at the mythological roots of our culture. And people get upset with me because I bring in religious themes, but I understand some things about mythology and religion. And it's not an accident that the axiomatic Western individual is someone who was unfairly nailed to a cross and tortured. It's like, yes, right, exactly. So what do you do about that? Well, I thought about that for a long time too. It's like, well, you don't get together in a damn mob, because all that does is allow you to be as horrible as you could possibly imagine and suffer from none of the consequences. That's a bad idea. So how about we don't do that? Well, there's a deep idea in the West too. It's like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it.
So he essentially says all these other things that people might want to do, such as taxing the rich, such as, ameliorating climate change in some way so you don't have a fucking, 3 billion refugees, within half a century. What you have to do instead is you have to bear your suffering. If you're one of those refugees, you have to bear your suffering. And it's very easy, again, for him to say, because as you point out, there's nothing for him to bear other than a near-death experience because he got hopped up on fucking drugs, right? He has nothing else to bear. right? Like this is exactly his function. How can we, in this like, capitalist superstructure, how can we serve as the cog in this machine that tells people do not get together, do not make demands, do not try for any kind of redistribution, but simply be proud of your suffering and bear it and walk with dignity, right?
Well, someone like him wouldn't even acknowledge. He probably doesn't even know I've seen, not in any of these videos we have, but I know I've seen when he talks about socioeconomics and whatnot. I don't think he even realizes that when people talk about redistribution in a socialist context, that they're really talking about a second redistribution, because the first redistribution was from the masses upwards.
Exactly. It's always been that way. It's always been bottom up redistribution. The second, however, you try to say, well, let's now redistribute in the other direction. Suddenly that's impossible. And of course, it's like, well, no shit. Those with all the power would indeed say, after getting everything at the top, no, it's no longer possible. After proving that it's possible from the bottom up, now we can't do it the other direction. Right. So, yeah, and that's exactly, that's part of this whole conservative grift.
And try to be a good person so you don't make it worse.
Imagine saying that literally, this is exactly what people told black people 50, 60, 100 years ago. Don't make it worse for you. Don't get in a mob. Don't get together. What are you you're going to do a fucking slave rebellion? Don't make it worse for yourself. Accept accept the slavery.
Look at his body posture. He's walking around, and I almost think he's going to go up and stamp his feet like a little infant. I mean, he's on the verge of a shit fit right here.
Yeah, exactly. He is.
Well, that's a truth. I read a lot about
gee willikers,
terrible things that people have done to each other. You just cannot even imagine it.
Now he's drawing the people in. I feel your pain.
So you don't want to be someone like that. Now, do you have a reason to be? Yes. You have lots of reasons to be. God, there's reasons to be resentful about your existence. Everyone you know is going to die. You too. And there's going to be a fair bit of pain along the way. And lots of it's going to be unfair. It's like, yeah, no wonder you're resentful. It's like, act it out and see what happens. You make everything you're complaining about infinitely worse. There's this idea that
just imagine that. How is this considered like intellectual advice? Like it's literally, don't complain about your status in society, even if it's unfair. That's not even a conservative principle anymore. This is like the most extreme right-wing radicalism imaginable.
And who complains the most in society? They say the far left, the far right. Yeah. I won't even wear a mask to protect my fellow neighbor. I thought in the 10 Commandments, it's treat others as you'd want. Or is that the goal? Treat others as you'd like to be treated. The golden rule. I'm not going to wear a mask. I'm not going to get vaccinated. If you die, fuck you.
Yeah.
Hell is a bottomless pit, and that's because no matter how bad it is, some stupid son of a bitch like you could figure out a way to make it a lot worse. So you think, well, what do you do about that? Well, you accept it. That's what life is like. It's suffering. That's what the religious people have always said. Life is suffering. Yes. Well, who wants to admit that? Well, just think about it. Well, so what do you do in the face of that suffering?
You've got stomach cancer. What do you want, an operation? Just die. Decrease the surplus population.
Start with yourself.
The Ebenezer
what good are you? Get yourself together, for Christ's sake, so that when your father dies, you're not whining away in a corner, and you can help plan the funeral, and you can stand
University
up
of Toronto presents a Christmas Carol starring Jordan Peterson.
Did you hear this? Like, this is such fucking hypocrisy, given what transpired. Just listen to this.
Whining away in a corner, and you can help plan the funeral, and you can stand up solidly so that people can rely on you. That's better.
What about his fucking wife? What about his addiction? What about his family that was depending on him? What about all this other shit? He's fucking like he's in a goddamn coma, almost dead, somewhere in some fucking Russian, a prison hospital of some sort, or whatever it was. And he's doling out all this life advice. And it will be fine because this was years ago, but he's not squaring with this part of his reality today. He's not able to be honest with his fans. He's giving out such hypocritical advice. He's exactly, and the reason why he's talking about other people's weakness and other people's anguish and other people's bear it. He's just projecting everything that he fears within himself. He fears that when it really comes down to it, he's not going to be able to bear it. And guess what? He fucking didn't. He got hopped up on drugs and he almost killed himself in the process. That's a fact. Okay. He wasn't able to bear it. He's exactly the kind of projection of weakness that he's imagining everyone else that is not in his position of power is. He's exactly that, which is why he's in a near tantrum here in the speech, right? Because he feels this about himself. It's so obvious.
The two things that I take away from this video, we're halfway through it. I don't know if you want to go through it anymore, but the first video, we see that is sort of the benign sciolism there, because we see the kid or whoever made that video that we're getting. That's the Oprah soft time.
Yeah.
Here, this video doesn't have those images, but when we see those three stooges sitting on the left there, and they're hiding or trying to hide their Snickers, the one guy isn't even really trying. You get the sense of this is the way these people really feel. That, I've got mine, you got yours, fuck you, ha, 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 I'm better than you. I mean, there's not even, if you really analyze this like we're doing, how could you, this is what it inspires. Cliched videos, images in the first, and a bunch of stooges sitting on the side laughing at everyone who's not white and male.
Yeah. Well, in the last 5 minutes, we don't have to go through it, but in the last 5 minutes, he does say something like the solution to all this is as follows, right? Which is kind of like a rehash of what he already said, which is transcend, make the suffering less, right? That's the verbatim quote, transcend, make the suffering less, right? Don't be a bad person. Don't be evil, transcend, make the suffering less. The problem with that advice, right, to the extent that it could even be construed as advice, is as follows. So he's a psychologist. He should understand what make the suffering less actually looks like in places with the most suffering. If you go to many places in the United States of America, there are tons of neighborhoods where the state has no reach. We're going to talk about this later when we talk about police brutality. The state has no reach. There is a de facto state of anarchy, a state of nature. And in that situation, to make your suffering less means I can at any given second be a victim. And the only way in a state of nature for me not to be a victim is I have to be a parasite. I have to be the aggressor. I have to be the one that's on top, because if I'm not on top, I'm going to be trampled upon. So ironically, this advice that he's doling out that he thinks is good advice to those people that need it the most, it's nothing more than a recipe for being a parasite, right? It's a recipe for being a predator upon your neighbors, right? Because there's no way around it. If there is no state reach, if there is no redistribution, if there is no improvement of material conditions, you cannot have anything other than a de facto state of nature, a state of anarchy where predation is the norm. And the way that you avoid feeling like you're going to be trampled or feeling this kind of, a prenatal pain that you carry before birth, during birth, after birth, whatever, is by trampling upon others. This thing that he claims that he wants to avoid, he's giving you exactly how to make it worse and worse and worse.
And someone like him, there's only two things that watching even just these two videos so far is that either he knows what he's saying is bullshit, and therefore he's a grifter, or he doesn't know what he's saying, and the effects, the ramifications of what he's saying, and he's an idiot. So he's either a grifter or an idiot. Which is worse?
Yeah, exactly. I think, and it is an open question, right? He definitely is acting in many places. We know that there's a line between the kinds of academic work that he was interested in back in the day and the kinds of interviews that he gave, decade and a half, 2 decades ago, versus who he has become now, right? And there's other facts, we know that he has not been honest with his audience about his recent troubles. So, putting all this stuff together, I definitely lean on grifter, right? But he is good at what he does in that sense. And so we could get into, so this is like much more kind of like, material reality. It's titled Truth About the Evil 1% of Society. This is more kind of like, this is from a channel called Success Chasers, right? All the people with the fucking, the Sigma grind set mentality, rise and grind, boys. We're gonna make it, and we're gonna do it essentially by trampling on everyone else.
I will say Jordan Peterson doesn't have the teeth of Tony Robbins.
Look, how much more do you have than most people have? You need to make $30,000 a year to be in the top 1% of the socioeconomic distribution worldwide. You always hear about the 1%, right? The evil 1%. And they churn, by the way, because it's not the same people all the time.
And of course, money isn't equally distributed. If you have 30 grand a year in the Philippines, you're living a high life that you can't live in the U.S. Even in Belize, for example, just less than 1,000 miles south of where I am, in Belize in Central America, 30,000 a year. I've even read Portugal. You have 30,000 a year. That's the equivalent of having 80 to 90,000 here in the U.S.
Yeah, and implicit in what he's saying is 30,000 actually is therefore not all that much. Like, doesn't this like naturally call to mind a explanation and justification for some kind of redistribution, if that is in fact the case? If we are living high off the hog and 30K a year in the top 1% globally, well, that must have come from somewhere, right? It did come from the global South. The number
and of course that ignores, I think there's something like 45 to 50 million people I read that are still in hunter-gatherer societies, whether it's that island off of Malaya where they're still cannibals, whether it's Patagonian or Inuits. There are people that are still not in the modern, 30,000. Give me a spear,
Yeah.
All of you here are in the evil 1%. And you think, well, that's not very fair because I was really only talking about within my country. Well, that's convenient for you. It makes it really, really convenient argument for you.
But if your cutoff is 30,000 a year, and yet you yourself are, making something like 10 million, let's say for Jordan Peterson, isn't that convenient for you that your cutoff is 30%? I mean, it's 30K.
I'm a little over 6 feet tall. And let's say I was 25 again, I couldn't make it in the NBA. But if the Pygmy tribe had a basketball league, I'd be Will Chamberlain.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, well, all those other people, those foreigners, they don't count. If they're poor, who the hell cares? It's the Australians that matter, And so, no, that's a non-starter, And by historical standards, you're doing a hell of a lot better than the top 1%. I can tell you that. I read a nice article by a coalition called Human Progress the other day, and they were comparing the typical middle-class person who lives now with Rockefellers in the 1919s, and say, well, would you rather be a middle
comparison? Because yes, the Rockefellers lived better than 99.999% in their day. The fact that, for example, they could have gotten polio like FDR did, it's a ridiculous comparison.
Yeah, it's like what I said earlier about, playing whack-a-mole. People like Peterson, they want to essentially stop history, right, at some sort of arbitrary cutoff point, right? And they don't care about the fact that, well, yes, like a century ago, things would have sucked. Like I would have preferred to be born when I was born compared to, a century and a half, or compared to like being in the time of Crassus. Even if I could be Crassus, I wouldn't want that billion in gold or whatever it was. I would prefer to be born today, right, and do the things that I can do today. But that is only a valuable comparison if you're going to start with the assumption that history at some point ought to stop, as opposed to what we do now, which is play whack-a-mole with whatever problem that comes up.
Class person now, or Nelson Rockefeller in 1919, and the answer seemed pretty damn clear that, well, if you were Nelson Rockefeller, then you would have been richer than anyone else. And there's something to be said for that status.
Actually,
right?
I think it was John D. Jr. Nelson wasn't born then. Well, he was a child, but
no.
Have more than others. It's a I don't know if it's a good thing or not, but it is one of the things that we like. And so you'd have that. You'd be richer than everyone else. But there'd be all sorts of things that you have that now that Nelson Rockefeller wouldn't have had a hope of purchasing, like the antibiotics that he would have needed to stop his son from dying.
It's funny how he keeps harping on Rockefeller. Well, what about today? What can, for example, Jeffrey Epstein have that someone without billions of dollars can't have? Oh, what do you know? It's a fucking pedophile island where for like 30 years, no one is coming after you. And when they finally do come after you, you get a slap in the wrist. You serve like a year and a half in prison. And then only when there's more outrage a decade later, do you finally, get in prison again and then kill yourself, right? Like why not? Why is this comparison like to the past, right? What about like today? Like what can money buy you today that is an example of unearned privilege? It's very obvious what that is.
I'm telling you, I'm glad that unlike my Norwegian forebears, I don't have to battle cave bears every day just to go fishing. So
yeah, so
I'm living the high life.
Yeah, exactly.
For example, just as a start. And so I think this complaint about inequality, look, no one likes inequality exactly. You walk down the street, this is why I always get a kick out of people who protest, I'm against poverty. It's like, really? You're against poverty, and you think that's a unique enough attribute so that it was worth your time to make a sign that said that you were against poverty and show other people. It's like, I've never met anyone that was for poverty.
Like, this is such a fucking word game and a conceptual game. I mean, just think about the fact that in this video and in the previous video, we know, for example, that, okay, so he will never say that he's for poverty, but Peterson, just like many people in the West, they are, number one, they believe that being born with obstacles does not entitle you to have them taken away. He believes that. He says the world's unfair. Grin and bear your suffering, right? Do not make a commotion. Do not get into a mob. Do not do anything about that. So we know that is the fact. We know that people in the West enjoy something like $150 trillion of value that we've extracted over the past century from the global South. That's from their pockets into our pockets. And then you look at the differences between the North and the South, and everything seems to make sense. We collectively decide on all kinds of red lines not being red lines. To go back to the example of the friend that I meet up once a year or so, he was asking me about homelessness, right? We have something like 500,000 or maybe close to 1 million technically of homeless people in the United States of America. And it's true that you could get into all kinds of policy debates okay, how can we reduce it? What are 1,000 things that we need to do to make it better? But the bottom line is as follows. Before you even get lost in the weeds there, the bottom line is this. We collectively as a society decide that there ought not to be some large pot somewhere with enough funding to ensure guaranteed housing, not a shelter, right? There's perfectly valid reasons for why homeless people don't want to live in shelters. I volunteered in shelters in the past. If I were a homeless person, I would not want to live in the shelter. But we collectively decide that there should not be some big enough pot of money somewhere that is then used to construct actual housing for people, enough housing that they never have to be homeless. Who knows what the cost is going to be? Maybe it would be billions of dollars. Maybe it's going to be give or take a few, but we make that decision. So you could say that, oh, no. None of us are technically against poverty. That's insane to say, but in your actions and in the policies that you support and the status quo that you think is perfectly fine because in the past, Crassus could have fucking died of the plague and you don't have to, you still are exactly taking on the actions and the policies that mean that poverty is okay, that suffering is okay, that homelessness is acceptable in terms of not having a red line there.
Yeah, two things. Number one, I think you mean Croesus. C-R-O-E.
Oh yeah,
not Crassus, but Croesus. And I would actually argue against you in that. I think there are people who have willingly and knowingly been agents of impoverishment.
No, I agree. I agree. I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Robert Moses, who who replanned New York to build the subways or whatnot. He mowed down homes. Guess what? In middle class black areas, blacks were doing quite well in 19 teens and through the Harlem Renaissance. They bulldozed that, and that became the model in many big cities, from Boston to DC to St. Louis to Philly to Cleveland to Chicago, all the way out to LA. It was an absolutely, it was planned down to the plat maps, of what they wanted to do. So yes, I think a lot of the stuff you can say is just a consequence of people's greed, and the people in charge are going to filter it up, and there's not an absolute plan. But there have been, and Robert Moses and the building and rebuilding of American cities in the last 120 years has absolutely been a planned assault on non-white riches.
Yeah, I think this is true. I just basically, like, when I go through a lot of the stuff, I like to concede, the argument on its face, and then just, go into like, what exactly, do we mean? Because there's, there's plenty of people, for example, in, let's say like liberal organizations, right? Let's say you're working for like a typical, like NPR, like whatever the fuck, right? You could say, for example, stop Asian hate. I hate, this, like all this like violence against like Asian people, blah, blah, blah. But they're not actually gonna be in favor of, for example, like changing the tax code that would force them to pay more in taxes, that would actually prevent some of this kind of stuff from happening. They would never be okay with like a forced desegregation regime that would move all these people into neighborhoods like mine. They would never want to fight. They would never want to do it.
Even in your lifetime, Alex, in the 1980s, when you were just a bouncing baby, there were people who did not want to fund research to ameliorate AIDS.
Yes, exactly. So, like it's this kind of odd thing where, like, I think generally speaking, it is true that if you're going to come up to any person on the street, like, are you into poverty? Are you for or against poverty? They will all have very clear answers, but there's a huge difference between that, right? Which is kind of what he's arguing for. The concession that I made is to this like utterly superficial level of argument that he's making. But when you really break it down, many of these people would not be willing to do the kind of sacrifices that would, be necessary for the changes that they claim that they would want to make to, ameliorate poverty, for example, right?
You walk down the street with someone who's pretty well off, and they've got 1920s spats on and a bowler, and they're feeling pretty damn rich, and a Stockster certificate sticking out of their back pocket, and there's a homeless person there, and they give them a good kick, and they say, the more poverty, the better. It's like, no. When people walk down the street and you see homeless people, and they're often, homelessness is a complex problem. Like, you think, well,
see, like starting with this fucking like starting with all these like slates of hand. Like, what do you mean by it's a complex problem? Like, the level of complexity is as follows. You don't think there ought to be a big pot of money somewhere that we all collectively pay for that builds housing for everyone that needs it, no matter what? Even if you want to be a junkie for the rest of your life, which is what he talks about, you still have a place to go shoot up, alone in your own apartment somewhere. You think that that's not acceptable. There's no anyway.
And the thing is, this gets back to UBI, which we talked about before, and I've done some shows on. There was just a study this year, just early this month, when 4 or 5 cities that they were doing tests on, where they did have universal basic income to people, and the overwhelming numbers, the people, more people were employed by the end of the year test because they were getting money, because they had the time to look for jobs.
Yes,
and the idea that maybe there's 5 or 10% of these poor people who will piss their money away, like those lottery winners who are impoverished and they get $10 million and they piss it away. Yeah. How many fucking rich people piss away their money? How many billions has the Trump family pissed away?
Yes, exactly. And, like when you think about something like UBI, right? This kind of a drip of money, and that, like, I don't like when you think about something like reparations. I don't want to say something like, there shouldn't be a lump sum, because that seems extremely, pretentious to say. Like who would I be to say to a black family, you don't deserve a lump sum, because statistics show that you would just waste it. It's true that most lottery winners end up being bankrupt within like 5-10 years. I think that's true. But when you look at something like a UBI, this drip of money is very useful. It doesn't allow you to do the kinds of, worst choices that you could possibly make if you suddenly, inherit money, or like whatever it might be. But it does give you what you need. Like, it allows you to get to the next point. It allows you to have the time to get to a job interview. It allows you to buy money so you could get clothes for a job interview.
And the thing is, giving people money doesn't scale in this manner. If I'm poor and I get money and I piss it away, well, you're too stupid, you piss it away. But if you're a Trump, if you're a Musk, if you're a Bezos, who lost money for 12, 15 years before he ever made a cent, supposedly, you know what? You turn around and go to the bank and say, well, I pissed the money away, but you're on the hook, so you're going to give me more money.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
A poor person doesn't have. So it's not, this is... People, they don't even understand, for example, graduated income tax. The same thing applies when it comes to money going up in terms of what you can extort from banks. Because, if I've only got 10,000 in the bank and I get another 10,000 UBI and I piss that 20 grand away, the bank isn't going to reimburse me, but they will reimburse a Musk or a Bezos or a Trump.
Yeah, just think about how much cushion, someone like a Jeff Bezos has, right? He could theoretically, like when he started Amazon, he was like, trust me, guys, we're not going to be profitable for a while, but eventually we're going to be really, really profitable. We're going to take over the world. And guess what? It turned out to be true. But for that to happen, he had to have received a ton of trust from investors, from banks. Are like, you know what, we're gonna take a chance on you. We're gonna keep funding this. But nobody on the street would ever get that kind of cushion. Imagine for Peterson, if a homeless person fucks up again and again and again, right? They're not gonna extend this for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years of credit worthiness, right? If you have a chance and you piss it away, guess what? You don't get a second chance. You don't get a third chance. But these other people, they do, right? Which is, again, it goes back to this conservative bedrock principle of we can't have unequal consequences for identical behavior. And yet, again and again, we seem to be having this unequal consequences for identical behaviors.
That's the norm, and that's the norm. That's the thing. They try to make it as if that's the outlier when that has been the norm and historically been the norm, going back to Croesus. Croesus kept which one of the greats? Croesus was it? It wasn't Sargon. It was. I think it was Cyrus the Great. Yeah, Cyrus the Great. When Cyrus the Great took over Croesus's territory at the tip of Anatolia, you know what? He literally, and this is documented. He said, we're going to keep Croesus in charge, and all of the losses that Croesus suffered, Croesus's coffer was filled back up by the Persians because Croesus knew how to deal with his people. They kept him in charge as a figurehead. That's the way it works. So it's worked from Croesus on, since you brought up Croesus.
And another thing that his audience definitely wouldn't get this, and people really don't get this in general, is when you do start acquiring more and more money, the room for error is just so it's astronomically higher.
It's not a linear progression.
It's not. It's exponential growth, right? It is absolutely the amount of things that you could get away with, the amount of fuck ups that you could be a part of, and literally never, ever feel them. It's really insane, right? But if you don't really think about the logic of capitalism, right? You don't think about the logic of how power tends to concentrate, and you don't think about the kinds of justifications that always come. It always comes from the top down, right? This is just going to go over your head. So anyway, watch what he says about homeless people.
People are poor. It's yeah, man. That's one problem they have out of 50. And I've worked with poor people, in my clinical practice, and poor in multiple dimensions. And many of them, you gave them money, they were just done. especially if they were like alcoholics and cocaine addicts. As long as they were broke, they had some hope of living through the next month. But as soon as their unemployment check showed up, man, they were face down in the ditch 3 days later, right?
Isn't that Peterson's own life example? He was fucking able to be strung out on his drugs in Russia. He didn't even have to stay in Toronto. He could take a little fucking trip and do it in Russia, right? Where they could accommodate him in exactly the ways that he wanted to be accommodated with his addiction, right? He's allowed to do that because he has money. And he's a perfect example of this, but this is not only acceptable for him, it's also acceptable for him not to be honest about it after it in fact happens. But these other people, because they're down in a ditch, because look, here they're down in a ditch. Superficially, they look different than Peterson. Peterson is in a fucking coma in a suit somewhere. These guys are down in a ditch. This image is supposed to make you feel less bad for them.
Yeah, I don't know his personal life, unlike you, so I can't comment on that. But what I will say is he makes the assumption that he says poverty is one of 50 things wrong with them. But how many of those 50 or 49 other things stem from poverty and poverty from birth?
Exactly.
If you're born poor in Appalachia, and even if you're white in Appalachia and you're born poor, you know, there's a stereotype of hillbillies that's still there, and in some ways is quite valid. They never get. I live right on the edge of the hill country here in Texas. And I can tell you, there are dumb white folks that are as poor and as ignorant and as strung out on drugs as any black guy in a Chicago projects.
And you know, like we had like another example like during the 2020 election, right, where Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, right? Perfect example. You know, here's a guy that has a lifelong, issue with drug addiction. And I remember arguing about this with my friend, and he was like, "Oh, like watch this. He has this addiction. He has XYZ wrong with him, and yet he has like all these other jobs." And I was like, "No, if you have enough money, guess what? You don't have an addiction. You've never done heroin. You've never had any of these issues, because if you have money, that wipes the slate clean, even if factually those things are issues that you dealt with. It no longer matters. You're still allowed to go get a job somewhere in Ukraine. You're still allowed to sell your paintings and launder money in that way. You're still allowed to do things that this guy face down in the ditch is not allowed to do, because he has no cushion to do it. And yet he would never, ever advocate for eliminating the cushion from someone like Hunter Biden. He would never advocate eliminating the cushion from himself. He wants to be able to be strung out in Russia. He wants to be able to do what he does.
And it can be celebrated. Long before you were born, when Jimmy Carter was president, he had a brother named Billy Carter. Now, this was before the big money thing, but Billy Carter was a drunk. Billy Carter was a national joke. If you look up Billy, the younger brother, he's long dead for 25, 30 years now. But Billy Carter was a national joke. And you know what they did to him? They made Billy's beer. And all of a sudden, Billy, it was like Duff beer from the Simpsons. Billy Carter, it only lasted for a year or two. But the fact is this guy who is a knockdown drunk, who was a national joke for the brother of the president, got that opportunity that if he had been able to straighten his life out, he could have made millions there too. So the opportunities come whether that person is capable of it or not.
Yeah, exactly.
Nothing but cocaine and alcohol with all their idiot friends for 3 days. And then they'd show up back in my practice saying, God, I relapsed again. I said, well, what happened? Well, my money came in. It's like, yeah, money's really going to do you a hell of a lot of good. It just kill you faster than poverty.
Right. This is the perfect justification for let's keep you in poverty. Right? It's just it's so obvious what is happening. This is such like how
Mother
can we prop up the status quo?
Is good. Suffering is good. Yeah. It brings you closer to Christ.
It's just insane how people could listen to this and not understand the implications.
Now, not that there's anything good about poverty, but it's not like these are simple problems. You walk down the street and you see someone who's been an alcoholic for 20 years and maybe they're addicted to methamphetamines as well, or maybe they're schizophrenic. It's like it isn't unequal distribution of monetary resources that is the primary cause for that problem, and it isn't going to.
Well, to the extent that they're strung out on the fucking street dying of a disease as it is, Hunter Biden isn't in a fucking ditch somewhere, with all these like marks and possible HIV, right, from shooting up heroin. Like, that's really the difference, right? You could be a functional junkie, or you could be a homeless junkie who does not have any cushion to be functional. To the extent that Hunter Biden is functional, I mean, he's able to have a job, he's able to paint, right? Like, why does he get to do this and nobody else can?
To be some sort of straightforward redistribution that's going to fix it, because it's way more complicated than that.
So let's not do anything. Right?
If we can only solve 75 or 80% of the cause problems, well, it's all or nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
Radical types, they follow Marx, and they say, well, one of Marx's dictums was that capital tended to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And that's right. That's true. Wealth and capital, income for that matter, but not only that, whatever it is that you might like to have accumulates in the hands of smaller and smaller numbers of people. It's a principle that was discovered by an economist named Pareto, Vilfredo Pareto, and he pointed out something that had been pointed out in the Gospels, by the way, thousands of years earlier, which was, to those who have everything, more will be given, and from those who have nothing, everything will be taken away. The rule being, once you start to succeed at something, the probability that you will continue to succeed ever more rapidly increases.
I'm not sure if you had the same response to this part as I did, but this is such an abuse of the Matthew principle is what it's called, right? And it doesn't just appear in the book of Matthew; it appears in I think Luke as well. But basically, so first of all, the way that he phrases it, once you start becoming successful, and you see like in the image in the background, right? It's like, I guess it's a guy. I thought it was a woman at first, driving a car with sunglasses and is clearly successful. Like he's talking about this in terms of this definitely is earned privilege, right? Not you're sitting on money that's like generational wealth, not anything like that. This is earned privilege, not you've taken money from the commons, not, the wealthier that you got, you paid less and less in taxes, relative to what you acquired. It's just this kind of generic success that we can express through this, like generic image of like a successful person driving a fast car, right?
Here's the thing, though. I never heard of that Matthew effect before you mentioned it, but his whole propounding here is that it's basically saying that money is a good thing, but it's only good for those who can handle it. Now, the thing with the money thing is, I've mentioned many times about we need a different kind of currency other than pelf. Yet he's talking about all these. You got to get yourself. I'm not going to be like that or whatnot. All of this stuff that has nothing to do with wealth. But if he really believed that, why is he so focused on the financials of life? So he's giving away his real intent by always, in this and many other videos, talking about success being equated with financial success. Yes, he'll then go back and he'll say, that's not going to help the guy who got a little shit, check from welfare and then blew it all on speed or whatnot, or whatever drug it might be. But he's not. There is a cognitive dissonance that he has with all of this that he doesn't seem to realize. That I want people to ameliorate and whatnot, but they have to do it without the financial benefits. Whereas my people, if you're white, you're rich, you're Canadian, and you're born with a silver spoon or even just a brass spoon in your mouth, we don't have to suffer that. It's the classic thing that was said about George W. Bush when he ran for president. He was born on third base and thinks he hit a triple.
Yeah. Like if Peterson was not rich, he'd be fucking dead from his addiction based on the story that I heard. If Hunter Biden was not rich, he'd be fucking dead at this point, right? And that's just kind of the reality. And I mean, like, just back briefly to this Matthew effect. I mean, and that's the thing, like he has this like he claims that he's religious, that he's like kind of like, I guess, like a follower of Jesus or whatever that he says, I guess in some way, in some vague way. But like he's turning this potentially unearned privilege, right, which is wealth, into an individual decision with some like level of moral force, right? You got to work hard to be successful. But if you actually go to the biblical story where this appears, it's basically a parable of servants, right? They're giving respectively 3, 2, and 1 bag of gold for safekeeping by a noble. The nobleman returns 2 of the servants, double the gold, and another servant hides it in a ditch. And this is what happens. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here's what belongs to you. Okay, so in this parable, the servants double the master's money by going to like a bank, right? By engaging in usury. Jesus Christ, throughout the New Testament, is constantly in conflict with these types of people. He's constantly saying that this is unearned wealth and unearned privilege. By the time that Muhammad comes around, it gets to the point where Muhammad is taking Christ's words so seriously that in Islam, you ban, these kinds of like financial instruments. You're not allowed to have them because this is what Jesus said. So in the parable, and I find this like just so wonderfully said, right? You're a hard man. You're harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. And then he gives them the gold and says, this is what you gave me originally, and therefore this is the only thing that still belongs to you. This is actually what's in the Matthew effect. It's about unearned wealth. It's about unearned privilege. And while he's like going around virtue signaling as a Christian, he's completely abusing these things. Like if you have any passing familiarity with this stuff, and I used to be a religious Christian, so I guess I'm more familiar with this, but he's just a fucking pretender. Like you could tell that he's a pretender. He doesn't even know what he's talking about, at the same time claiming that this is like some of the most like the deepest philosophy that drives him personally. And it clearly doesn't.
I know. Is Peterson a more fundamentalist kind of Christian, or I don't know about his personal?
I think he's more kind of like he's let's just call him like vaguely Christian, right? Like not maybe not strictly, but he would say that he believes in Jesus or something, or like whatever, something like that. But like whatever, like but even if you're not a Christian, like what, you can't fucking like read about the Matthew principle. You can't go to the primary source and like not lie to your audience about what it's about anyway.
So there's an exponential function with regards to success, but there's also an exponential function with regards to failure.
There's also an exponential function, not in success, but simply sitting on capital. Like that's also what he's missing.
So failure and success aren't like this. They're like this. Fail, die. Succeed ridiculously. Like it's this weird curve. And it's funny because it doesn't just characterize economics. It looks like a really fundamental economic law. I was actually quite shocked when I first learned about this, which was only about 15 years ago, because I thought most things were normally distributed. It turns out that that's not true.
Now, anyone who has ever been poor can tell you just what he said there. The fact that he said that he only found out about that 15 years ago. Yeah. Let's say this was 5 years ago. So he would have been in his mid to late 30s. Shows you how well insulated he has been from reality. Right there, he's saying, I am out of touch with the real world.
Yeah. I mean, lifelong academic in Toronto, right? Like, putting all these things together, you'd sort of, and that's the thing, that he's so exactly like all his like shit talking about academia. He is exactly the problem with academia.
Creatively isn't normally distributed. A small proportion of people produce most of what's of value.
And this is interesting. So he goes from this kind of, financial argument to just when it comes to human creativity, a small number of people produce most of what's value. So before we get to what else he's saying. Well, I mean, is it even like literally true? Because like to the extent that let's say most people in the world, global South or whatever, they are, the ones that are, picking crops. They're the ones that are mining for precious metals, right? They're the ones that are doing the grunt work. There are people in the United States, they're sanitation workers. They work in, grocery stores. So that's kind of like the day-to-day value of like what's necessary to survive. It seems like there is this kind of majority that is producing the majority of day-to-day value, right? Outside of the more kind of abstract stuff, they're producing the day-to-day value that allows people like Peterson to live in the first place, right? To have, a base, of an audience that he has that's able to throw money at him. Those other people on the bottom, they're producing all that value. And in exchange, they're getting the least in return compared to everyone else. And then when he gets to the more kind of abstract stuff, it's just as problematic.
It doesn't matter what it is. And you know this, it's like, how many books does Stephen King sell? It's like half the books, right? And then there's the next guy after Stephen King, and no one even knows who he is. And he sells like 1/10 as many books as Stephen King. And then there's author number 50, and out of the thousands and thousands of offers, and he's barely scraping by. And then there's the bottom 99.9%, and they can't make a living writing.
But like, think about how, so he begins the statement by saying a small fraction of people produce the majority of human value. He moves it to Stephen King, and he's back. He's not even talking about like whether or not this is quality writing. He's not assessing the quality of Stephen King. He's not assessing the quality of these other books. He's only assessing how much are they able to sell, right? Because he can't escape this.
Success by him is measured simply by health, by money. That this is basically an infomercial that reveals what he really feels about what real life success is.
Yeah, he just can't escape this logic anywhere that he goes. Even when you think that he's going to be talking about something abstract, right? Creative value. What does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that really mean? He can't fucking help himself, and he's back to, well, how many books did this guy sell? That's really what's the value, right?
And that's how it is. And it's the same with musicians. And it's the same with athletes. If you look at number of goals scored, for example, in hockey, I'm a Canadian, so I'll use that. There's a small percentage of absolutely phenomenal hockey players, even in something as amazing as the National Hockey League or any professional sports league. You have to be one hell of an athlete to make it in a professional sports league. And still, you get this tiny group of superstars who are way better at it than anyone else.
I think it's ironic, or maybe it's not ironic. It's probably very telling that, sports is one of the few places in life that is, I don't want to call it pure meritocracy. There's plenty of people that, could have been, let's say, something, and yet they never got the opportunity to. But it's much closer to a meritocracy than some of the other institutions that we have. And yet it's also one of the easiest things to quantify, right? Like when it comes to like, figuring out like who's the best basketball player, who's the best hockey player, you could look at some objective metrics and come away, in a way that's kind of inarguable, right? This is one of the few things that tends to be a meritocracy, something that is like so simple and easy to measure.
And so there's this weird rule that as you get more, getting even more gets easier. And who knows why it is exactly. Partly it's practice, and it characterizes all sorts of situations. Like it characterizes the size of planets. A small number of planets have almost all the mass. It characterizes stars the same way. It characterizes biomass in the Amazon
from social theory to hard science. There's a fundamental difference between charting the career of Wayne Gretzky and the fact that the sun makes up 99% of the mass of the solar system.
But there's there's still a connection, right, that he's not privy to, or maybe that he is, but he's sort of keeping from his audience. And it's as follows. If you want to make this kind of argument in physics, it seems to me like, even when you like break it down to like pure, like behavior of like masses in the cosmos, There is this kind of rent-seeking behavior, right? And power and mass and everything tends to aggregate together. If that is in fact the case, and we know that this is in fact the case, and we know that this has little to do with whether it's earned or not, this is simply, basic rent-seeking behavior that we could see anywhere. Shouldn't we do something to change that? Because we are like not merely lumps of mass. We actually do have some, level of freedom, some level of individuality.
According to him, economic theory is no different than gravity. It's a fundamental force. What he's trying to do here is equate that things are the way they are, and you can't do it. If you jump up, you're going to fall. You come back down. That's just the way it is. We can't change it.
Yeah. It's amazing to me, though, how like little by little, like it is fascinating to watch how, all this like economics as a science bullshit has been, very much chipped away at. Right. People still believe it. There's still people that believe shit like, efficient market hypothesis. There's no way that you could make money trading. There's no way that you could do X, Y, Z because the academics say it. Right. So, but little by little, right. We are, but still there's people like Peterson, right? People that are still, the conservative mindset, they can't help but try to view things in scientific terms that are useful to them and then renege on science, renege on, any kind of metric like this when it's no longer usable for them. And obviously everybody does that, right? Like liberals do the same thing, right? They don't want to look at science when it's not useful for them.
By making it such an inapt comparison, say, with economic theory to gravity, he wants to be able to say, listen, jump up, jump down. You understand gravity? Yes, Jordan. Yes, Jordan. Yes. Now, this is the way the economics work. It's just as plain. Don't you see it? Yes, Jordan. Yes, we see it too.
Yes.
It's a false equation that's meant to get just easy huzzas.
Yeah.
It characterizes city size. A small percentage of cities have almost all the people. It's like, what's that? And then you go back 10,000 years.
And these same people are going to be like, oh, fuck, like these like goddamn blue state, liberal, like bi-coastal elites, right? And obviously, yes, this is a problem. It is a problem that power has so concentrated into the coasts, into the cities. This is exactly what conservatives have been arguing about. And yet, when it's something that's useful to them, right? Let's break this apart. Let's make it no longer the case. Then it's possible. But here, he's trying to make it ironclad, right? He doesn't even see how these arguments can be used all the way in the other direction to say exactly the things that he's not arguing for. And he's not willing to show that to his audience.
You look at a Paleolithic gravesite and you see what people are buried with. And like there's one guy, there's two guys there, he's just covered with gold, right? The gravesite is insanely rich and everyone else has like a bone and it's theirs. And that's it, And so you analyze Paleolithic gravesites, you see exactly the same Pareto distribution. A small number of people are buried with all the wealth and almost everyone else has none. And so it's this unbelievably deep proclivity of resources to distribute themselves unequally. And you know this too, because you play games like Monopoly, right?
This is a very funny comparison.
You all played Monopoly. What happens when you play Monopoly? You all start out equal, right? Exactly 100% equal. And you all have an equal chance of winning because it's basically a game of chance. Not entirely, because you can play stupidly, but but you can only play so intelligently because you're at the mercy of the dice. And what happens inevitably is that some evil capitalist ends up with all the money and all the hotels and all the houses and just like takes you out.
And like we made Monopoly. Does he like not understand this? We invented the game of Monopoly. We invented the fucking rules. Okay. Like in the same way that everything else that he's talking about is, to the extent that human beings are refusing to intervene in such things, they are also inventing those rules. If you are happy in your position of power, you're not going to try to rock the boat. You're not going to say, let's rewrite the rules, right? So it's a game of Monopoly that, again, you have written the rules, and to the extent that you're not doing anything about that, you keep making sure that the rules stay as they are. Like these are such bad examples. Like it's just incredible that people don't see this, though.
And yet you play and you don't think, oh my God, you know, there's something fundamentally unfair about that. Or maybe you play non-competitive Monopoly, where after every round you redistribute the money so everyone...
He's like, what a piece of shit.
The problem with Karl Marx, as far as I'm concerned, is that he was nowhere pessimistic enough. It's like, no, you can't blame inequality on capitalism. In fact, capitalism is pretty good at ameliorating inequality. Like, there's still plenty of inequality in capitalist societies, make no mistake about that. And you can make some claim, although it's a tricky one, that some indices of inequality have increased over the last 20 years. It depends on how you measure it, because it's complicated. Because
again, it's complicated. It's not fucking complicated. We're approaching medieval era levels of inequality, and he wants to sit around calling it complicated.
You know, even poor people now have access to, well, let's say iPhones, which have more computational power than the entire system that put the Apollo 11 on the moon, which is, you know, for $600, which isn't a bad bargain. So
like
it's not that easy.
Feudal serfs, you can take 5% of the grain I give you and grow some stuff for your family. So don't complain that all your work is going to the master.
It's not that easy to do those economic calculations, but one of the things you can say about capitalism and about private property and about the idea that people have a right to what they earn and a right to what they own is that it's pretty damn good at generating wealth. And the wealth isn't equally distributed by any stretch of the imagination, but a fair bit of it goes to the bottom.
What is a fair bit of it, right? It's like these weasel words. What does that mean? What does define a fair bit? Is it fair that 90% of the world population lives under $10 a day? Like, is that like, does that, like, what does that mean?
And the bottom, you know, 95% or at least is the one generating the wealth. Elon Musk doesn't generate wealth.
Yeah, exactly.
He was born with a $150–200 million emerald mine.
Yeah.
And that's why we're seeing, well, a relative dearth of tremendous deprivation. And you might say, well, we want to squeeze out that last bit of inequality.
And like, again, like just listen to that last bit. What is that last bit? Like this is so, like, he knows that he's being dishonest. There's no way that he doesn't know what he's doing or why he's choosing certain words over others. And it's odd because, like, he has like another video where he's talking about, like, yes, inequality exists. Yes, it's unfair. You have to grin and bear it. You have to transcend, blah, blah, blah. And now it's almost as if like he's conceding the point that inequality exists. But look, we've actually made so much progress, haven't we? We are now at that last tiny little fucking bit, right? As if we're not talking about a bottom 90% that is living on $10 a day, producing everything of value as we extract more and more and more from the South, more and more into our own pockets.
And it's like, well, maybe we do, and maybe we don't. It's not so obvious, first of all, because even if we did want to, we don't know how. And we certainly do know that if there are some ways that if we go about it, then things really go to hell in a handbasket really fast. And everyone ends up equal because they're all starving and dead. You end up in a situation like Venezuela. Not that they're all starving and dead, but the average Venezuelan lost 17 pounds in the last year. And that wasn't from voluntary diet, right? And that's a very rich country. And so we do know that there are ways of ameliorating inequality that just don't work. And so it's a dangerous thing to mess with.
Work like UVI.
Yeah. And, you know, well, I mean, just in general, there's plenty of things that we do know that work. Like if you change the tax system, sorry, it's going to work. If you don't want people, you know, face down in the ditch, as he said, you have to give them a house. That takes money. Too bad. That's the cost, right?
Even though the 1950s had a lot wrong with them, even if you just take white people and put aside minorities, there was a fairer distribution amongst white people in the 1950s. And guess what? Aside from a few little hiccups that were caused by the rich people on Wall Street, we went basically from 1945 to the Arab oil crisis of 71 or 72. We went a full quarter of a century with prosperity that was distributed more fairly than any other time in certainly American history, if not human history.
Yeah. Do you have any closing remarks on Peterson? Maybe we should close on him and then move on to the other stuff.
You had the one go anti-vax one. Did you want to do that
yeah. Let's go back to the screen share then. Yeah, so I guess this is a nice way to like finish up his
with, because we don't.
All right. So, Jordan Peterson, he like this is like a disturbing video to watch. Like, he looks like he's on the brink of another fucking breakdown. This is like after all that shit happened to him, obviously. And like I said,
haggard.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, he may be like dumb in some ways, I guess, but he's definitely not so dumb that he's not going to get vaccinated, no matter what his fucking audience thinks. But now, if there's a mini little fucking rebellion of audience members that decided not to get vaxxed because of all the shit that they were listening to from his own.
Dave Rubin. This is Dave Rubin.
Yeah. Because like a bunch of his audience members got upset at him for getting vaxxed. Like, and you see this with a lot of these like personalities, right? If they ever decide to get vaxxed, everyone's pissed off at them. Now he needs to.
Dave Rubin, the neocon who claims to be a liberal.
Well, he no longer claims to be a liberal, right? He sort of started with that, but like if you're a liberal, like you need, it's not that you have to be smart to make it, right, in this kind of ecosystem, but you do have to be a little bit smarter than the average conservative in this ecosystem. You could you could be a conservative. You could go on Twitter and say, "Oh, fucking look, like you're saying climate change is real. I just, walked out and, it's like, it's 5 degrees in New York City right now. And you're telling me climate change is real, and you're going to get like 1 million retweets and people are like, yeah, what a great fucking argument. So, and Rubin, he's definitely not smart enough to be, a liberal hack. So he decided to become a conservative hack. But anyway, this is now.
Understand, the climate, I've said this. Climate is like a top that's spinning. And when you put more energy into it, the top is not going to spin necessarily more fast. It's going to wobble. And so you're going to get climate wobbles here and there. You're going to have the Texas, like we had in Texas last year, where we had a cold spell. You're going to have 100 degrees up in Alaska. But overall, across the globe, it's getting warmer. Just had to throw in that scientific bone mo.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like that's like a very, very basic level of knowledge that if you have like a basic level of education, which more liberals tend to have, like you're going to know that, right? So that kind of a grift won't work for you, right? But Rubin, again, like he needed to go that route because I guess he wasn't smart enough. But so here's Peterson justifying to his rabid fan base the reason why he did it, and now why he suddenly regrets it. But I really doubt that he regrets his vaccine decision.
Canadians who aren't vaccinated now cannot leave the country. Yeah. Like, what the hell? Why is that? And I got vaccinated and people took me to task for that. And I thought, all right, I'll get the damn vaccine. Here's the deal, guys. I'll get the vaccine. You fucking leave me alone.
Like that's like, he looks like he's on the brink of a fucking breakdown. Like, what is that? He's having a tantrum. Like he's thinking that he's getting the vaccine as a favor. No, dumb fuck. Like, you're trying to keep yourself from dying. You just had a near-death experience. You've racked up so many comorbidities at this point. Like, anything could topple you over, and you're going on the show and you look like you're about to die already. Like,
the Proud Boys told me.
Yeah,
I'm gonna get the damn vaccine, even though they don't want. This is ridiculous. Go ahead. Let's see play the whole thing. 2 minutes.
Yeah, and how he starts discussing the science, like it's very it's clear that he knows better.
And did that work? No. So stupid me. That's how I feel about it. It's like, well, now I have to get tested for COVID when I come back into Canada. I have to get tested before I leave Canada. Now, that might be the latter issue. That's an issue with the Americans, and so that's outside of the Canadian purview. But the restrictions to get back into Canada are even more stringent. It's like, well, why to get the vaccine then if you're not going to leave me alone? And I don't think the evidence that unvaccinated or that vaccinated people are less contagious, let's say, I don't think it's very compelling.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Like this has become such a common talking point on the right, that people that are vaccinated do not shed the virus at any lower rate than someone that is unvaccinated. Now, this may be true, But what they're missing is the most obvious point. If you're vaccinated, you have a much lower chance of getting the virus, which means you have a much lower chance of shedding anything to begin with and transmitting it to another person. So this, I'm sure that he understands this, right? This is not a very complicated point. But whenever I look at Twitter, this is like always the argument that people are having. And actually, like, liberals don't even properly respond to that point, meaning in the way that I responded to it, right? They themselves don't even understand that this is such a bad talking point, and it doesn't fucking matter, right? As long as you are the one that's not shedding it, that's all that matters, right?
Well, and they don't understand even basically, even before we got the Omicron stuff, and even the first few months of the pandemic, is that the reason you mask up is not necessarily to prevent you from having it, but if you have it or you're a carrier, from spreading it. So this is probably the rationale a lot of anti-maskers use, is that, well, it's my body and but no, you wear the mask. It's going to have a minimal effect maybe in stopping you from getting it, but it will have a greater effect from spreading it, because the older people say, I can't breathe as well. Yeah. Well, if you can't breathe as well, let's assume that. Doesn't that say then you're less likely to put stuff out into the environment? I mean, their whole rationale has nothing to do with the science of what the disease is about. But anyway,
it's about a perceived attack on their autonomy, right? Because their autonomy trumps everybody else's right to not die.
Yeah.
So why are the unvaccinated all of a sudden a danger? And I certainly don't understand the push to get children vaccinated. I think that's absolutely reprehensible. And I also can't figure out.
But why? Like, why? Oh, like, what's going to happen to the children that are vaccinated? Like, what is it? Like, he doesn't spell it out. He doesn't say this thing is going to cause like a mass casualty event because of unintended, side effects of vaccines. He's not dumb enough to say that. He doesn't want to say that. And yet, he's leading there.
When I was a kid, on my left arm, I still have little things here from the measles, mumps, rubella vaccinations, from the polio vaccinations. Why this is an established part of modern Western life, the very Western values that he was chiming in about so glowingly in these other videos. This is science triumphant. It took us less than a year to develop the fucking vaccines. A modern marvel. He should be crowing that this is about Western triumphalism. Except it doesn't play to his increasingly lower base.
He's talking about like rich men in the past dying of diseases we no longer deal with. But wouldn't Nelson Rockefeller, who was really John D. Rockefeller Jr. in 1919, wouldn't he want the vaccine? I'm betting my money that Rockefeller was smart enough and smarter than Peterson's people he would be one of the first ones. I'm sure that the majority of the conservative personalities that are out there are saying, fuck the vaccine, I'm never going to get vaccinated. I am positive most of it have been vaccinated. Which of these people really want to die? How many of these people truly believe that, a coronavirus is just the flu? I would wager not very many, right? That's another way that, money does really cushion you, right? It allows you to spread propaganda to people below you that are listening to you, taking your advice. You kill them off, and yet you're going to keep making your own money.
Norman Deutsch wrote a piece in Tablet called Needle Points. And one of the things he pointed out was that if you take the top 25 least trusted institutions, in that group, the most distrusted institutions include Big Pharma. Mm-hmm. And for good reason. And he details out the lawsuits that Big Pharma has had to pay because of misbehavior on their part, broadly speaking, multiple companies over the last 20 years. And they're the biggest lawsuits in American history, which is really saying something, because your court system is set up so that big lawsuits are really possible.
Right. And so let's punish them, right? Let's keep them from taking from the commons by increasing the fines, by increasing how much taxes they have to pay, right? But he's not going to be okay with that. On top of which, it seems like he's not even on board with the products of pharmaceuticals anymore. If there's a new vaccine that's necessary, he's going to say no.
And so I see
take away their patents.
Yeah, exactly. Something that Biden could have done literally on the day that he got elected. Biden could have said, okay, it's now clear that I am the winner of this election. I'll be inaugurated on January 20th. When that happens, I will want the rest of the world to have built up enough infrastructure that they can start producing their generic versions of vaccines, because I will allow the patents to lapse. He didn't do that.
Why do you think India is suffering so much?
Exactly.
You haven't allowed them.
And this is one of the things where, like, people rightly say that Trump is responsible for many of the deaths during coronavirus. And obviously he is, right? On his conscience ought to be at least 250,000, 300,000 dead Americans, right? He literally murdered those people. I think that's 100% true. But, Trump's not in office anymore. When it was clear that Biden was in office, now, it's true that Biden is not saying don't get the vaccine. He's not saying don't go maskless. He's not saying we shouldn't have shutdowns. He's all for that. But the carnage that he is unleashing is on the rest of the world. It's on places like India, and these are the places where you would have these multiplying variants that will continue to get out of control, that you will then have to develop new vaccines for. Right now, they're developing an Omicron vaccine. Eventually, you might have something that is not mild as goose milk, as it were. Maybe you're going to get something that's deadlier. But because of the fact that he's not willing to lapse these goddamn patents, right, that needs to be in his conscience too. It's true. Biden is not killing Americans, but he's killing people abroad.
But the thing is too, is it's perfectly legal. Back in the War Powers Act, when you can declare an emergency in the country and take hold of factories and say, now you're going to produce material for war. In this case, for the war on COVID, let's say, it's absolutely 100% legal that Biden could have done that. He could have said, listen, we just gave your company however many billions, if not trillions of dollars to your industry. You're just gonna break even. That's all.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to break even, fuck you. We're doing it for the good of the country. But
on some level, there are conservative critiques of, mandates and vaccination, some of them that I, in fact, do agree with, but they never begin where they ought to begin. They always veer off into conspiracy. They start to me, I think one of the biggest problems here is, people are tired of COVID largely because we had, a non-response for a year, which, we therefore needed, lockdowns, and we need all this other stuff. It's not under control very well because, people don't want to get vaccinated. There's other problems there's problems with access,
And the thing is, unlike the Black Death, and unlike even the most recent AIDS, we could have fundamentally exponentially had less casualties across the globe if we had just done these basic things like masking and then everyone getting vaccinated. So much of imagine in 1380, imagine in 1980, if we could have had a vaccine for the Black Death or AIDS. How many people who had AIDS would have given their left eye tooth or whatnot to have that vaccine? And here now, because of all of this stupidity that's propagated by all of these sciolists like him, we have people who are refusing, who are inviting a pandemic and multiplying it exponentially across the globe. This is what, when people say, it's just harmless stupidity, this is the kind of thinking that an idiot like this, whether it's in personal healthcare, taking care of oneself mentally, whether it's in the finances or whether it's in this kind of stuff, this is why idiocy and sciolism can kill. Literally, sciolism is probably responsible for, I'd say, 3/4 of the deaths that are unnecessary around the globe.
And this goes back to what he said earlier about we in the West, right? As long as you make $30,000 a year, we're in the top 1%. We should appreciate this, blah, blah, blah. He gets something that so many people in the world cannot get, which is a vaccine against a virus that you do not want to acquire. And instead of taking it proudly instead of being thankful for it. He's having a fucking temper tantrum. I'll get the damn vaccine. You leave me alone, right? Like he's about to fucking cry about it, right? He's not even able to appreciate this, right? Because he's so like just so self-absorbed. He doesn't even understand what he has.
The leftists, all of a sudden, it's like big pharma. Yeah, trust them. It's like, what? What? Really? You guys? This is... I don't understand that at all. Like, and psychologically, so what's going on here? It's like, well, I think the underlying phenomenon is something like,
you're not a Tuskegee Airman with black skin. You know, white people have never been subjected unless they were considered idiots and in institutions. They were never considered disposable. So yeah, you know, his equation right there is silly.
It's for health and safety. It's always good. And, you know, not to get conspiratorial here.
He believes there's for health and safety. He got fucking vaccinated.
But the same damn thing is going to happen with the climate change push.
Absolutely.
They're already it's already being reconfigured as, well, it's the biggest public health issue of our time.
It is. What is it? Like, why is this so controversial to say? Like, okay, so all these conservatives, they don't want to deal with refugees, right? So like you go to fucking Iraq, you destabilize the region, you get involved in Syria, you have millions of refugees as a result. Now you say, you know what? I know we created this mess, but we're not going to be responsible for it. We're only going to take in like, maybe, 10,000, 20,000, whatever the number is. Now you in the West, you're creating these issues overwhelmingly. And after creating potentially billions of climate refugees, what are you going to say then? Are you going to say, sorry, we're not going to take you? Are you going to just say, you know what, we created this problem? And as a conservative, I believe in taking responsibility. So come to us. We know that's not going to happen. Right. It's like there's no consistency from point to point, from video to video, the total lack of consistency. There's so much chaos in this guy's mind. Right. He's always talking about chaos and order and all this other shit. But there's so much chaos in his mind. He cannot follow even a linear fucking argument.
It's like, no, I don't think so. I think overreaching bureaucrats are the biggest health. What would you say? The biggest challenge to our health of our time.
Anyway, so that's
and 150 years ago, Tammany Hall was a big health issue.
Yeah.